Good afternoon, everybody. For those of you whom I haven't met, my name is Mike Clegg. I'm Dean of the school, and I want to welcome you to today's symposium. I was in Australia when the earthquake and then the tsunami hit, and I was meeting with faculty from Kyoto University. And we didn't know at the time what had happened, and then after the meeting found, to everybody's shock, what was going on in Japan. And from there I went to Taiwan, where everyone was concerned about Japan, but also concerned about what way the wind was blowing. And then I went to China and met John, and we were talking about how, as a school of public health, what are the kinds of things that we can do in these kinds of times of crises. And clearly, we have many missions, but one is to present evidence and to do research. And it's a sad irony that our mission is never more important when big disasters happen. So it was that discussion with John, and then I know he talked to people around the school about having a symposium in a relatively short time to talk about what happened in Japan. So today is that symposium. It was a perfect storm of things going wrong. And that's I guess going to be a theme for what we're going to talk about today. A man-made disaster, a natural disaster followed by a technological failure. And we all know that in addition to the destruction of property, the destruction of lives, the psychological sequela of people who go through these kinds of experiences, and they're equally significant and something that we have to deal with and something we've had an interest in the school about. So today I think we hope to learn from this crisis, the crisis that's still going on. And today really represents a collaboration between two important centers at the school, which we'll hear about, and the institutional office for preparedness, the Office of Critical Event Preparedness. So I'm going to stop here and just introduce Dr. Jonathan Links, who is a professor in the Department of Environmental Health Services and Environmental Health Sciences. And John is a medical physicist who came to the school to study medical imaging, and that's what his research is based on. But after 9/11, when we needed expertise on terrorism and dirty bombs and radiologic disasters, John moved into the world of preparedness, started to work with local and regional health departments, and now heads the Office of Public Health Preparedness, and plays a big role at the university level in terms of helping the university think about institutional risk and preparedness. So Jonathan, thank you and everybody else for organizing today.
Thank you, Mike. Good afternoon, everyone. So as Mike indicated, there's a lot of activity in this university around what I'm going to call disaster health. So really disaster medicine and public health preparedness. And there are several centers here at the school that deal with public health preparedness, with refugee health, with humanitarian assistance, and so on. And there's, as Mike alluded to, an enterprise-wide Office of Critical Event Preparedness and Response called CPAR for short, that started out dealing with preparedness here at home, meaning the university and the health system, and has branched out through a Department of Homeland Security grant to really being an academic center as well as a service center. And all of us got together and thought we really need to talk about what's going on in Japan, and of course what's still going on in Japan, and some of the lessons learned. And so we put together this afternoon's mini symposium in an attempt to get the conversation started at more of a school and university level. And so the idea this afternoon is really to look at what's happened from several different perspectives, certainly from a disaster health perspective, from a mental health perspective, from, in my case, a radiologic perspective, and so on, and to, as I say, start thinking about all of these various issues and facets with this disaster, unfortunately, really typifying a lot of the critical issues these days in disaster health. So without further ado, let's get started. Our first speaker is Tomohiko Makino, who I know because he's a former MPH student. of recent vintage. And he's now a fellow in emergency medicine. And so he's still with us. And so we have someone with a native Japanese perspective on what's happened, but someone who's also been trained in public health preparedness and disaster health. So Tomo, please.
First, thank you very much for Dean Craig and Dr. Links for conducting this very significant event in a timely manner, focusing on the Japanese disaster. And I also appreciate all the people paying attention to the disaster issue and all the thoughts and support for us. Thank you very much. And I'm an MD medical doctor by training in Japan, and I worked for the health ministry before starting my MPH program here in the area of preparedness and response. I was in charge of the pandemic preparedness or bioterrorism preparedness, as well as respond to the most of the disasters which occurs almost once in a year at the level of the magnitude 6.0 or something. So it's a great honor. So here's my title. What is happening? The intention of is happening is that disaster started on March 11th with a strong earthquake, which is magnitude 9.0, but it generated a tsunami and a nuclear event, which is still ongoing or getting worse and worse. So I really want you to have some image, a vivid image, what is still ongoing and how much difficulties the people there in Tohoku area in Japan have. So this is the first description of the disaster at the beginning. So the disaster occurred about 3 p.m. in the local time with a magnitude 9.0, and almost right after that, warning issued. And after 30 minutes to 1 hour, the huge tsunami affected. So this slide shows a real epicenter, point epicenter of Japan, offshore of the northeast area of Japan, but certain surveys after disaster revealed that the real earthquake occurred in a line, not a point, meaning that all the tsunami will not be the circular way, but mostly kind of burst, like linear tsunami affected with limited attenuation, and that enhanced the impact of the tsunami. And here this slide shows all the afterquakes more than the magnitude of 5.0, which will be counted as the major earthquake by alone. So it is also still going up, and almost every once in a day, this type of earthquake is occurring in this area. And this shows all the epicenters of earthquake that covers almost all the area of Japan. That distance is about 400 miles from here to here, covering all the offshore area. The distance is from here to Boston something. So most of the large area is under the earthquake still now. This shows the figures of the casualties and affected people. The death and missed counts up about 25,000, but it itself very large compared to the other major earthquake like Katrina 5,000 or Kobe or Hanshin Awaji in 1995 6,000, still large. But a police officer declared that the real number is still unknown, meaning so many wiped towns or homes are wiped out and no one reports who is missing. So the real impact is very much, maybe almost double or triple. And evacuated people now in the shelters is still more than 100,000. It was up to 500,000, 500,000, but most of them had identified their own place to live in the hotels or some relatives. And the shelters are so much defected, and the number is counting up because of so many investigations ongoing. Then this number will indicate how many people will suffer from the long-term displacement and need to have tentative houses or shelters. And some houses are now built in front of the affected area. Tsunami cleaned up everything, and here's a new tentative housing. And now the numbers are still not enough. And health issues. It is also common. It was very cold winter, and the northeast area is very cold. So first health challenge was hypothermia and deep venous thrombosis, where evacuated people didn't move a lot. And after 1 or 2 weeks, the tsunami lung occurred. The tsunami lung is a kind of pneumonia caused by the toxic chemicals brought by tsunami or certain chemicals floating after tsunami, because tsunami cleans and mix up everything. And infectious disease was not at the focus at the beginning, but it is now occurring. Like most of the, there are hundreds or some patients dying because of the pneumonia, is generic pneumonia. And influenza B is now spreading out. And gastrointestinal disease like norovirus is also spreading out. And these three diseases are more cautious to the volunteer workers who are supporting from all the Japan to the area, like tetanus and rickettsia. Rickettsia is a river fever disease, are also notified. And the measles, unfortunately, Japan doesn't have controlled measles well, so the volunteer workers bringing measles to the affected area and spreading. And one reporter overseas, a media reporter, got measles and keep on interviewing to people. So this type of thing is also occurring. So please imagine all the public health issues are ongoing in that area. And the nutrition balance for long-term cancer means that most of the relief materials are composed with carbohydrate, only rice or breads, and not well balanced in nutrition manner. So the long-term evacuees need more nutritional care, and also mental health is very important, which will be mentioned later. And there are additional health issues based on the Japanese demographics, which is very much old. Meaning, Japan is enjoying the longest life expectancy in the world, meaning good outcome of the public health. But it also means that many people are very old, having so many underlying diseases, and these people will have more, and we need more healthcare in the evacuation stations. And the radioactive agents add more consideration regarding decon and monitoring. This is very much a generic picture of all the disasters. This picture shows people are in line to get the relief materials, food, water, something. They are all wearing masks to avoid any chemicals inhalation that may cause lung disease. And this is, the gymnasiums are used for evacuation camps. So, but the other side, what do you think these people are doing? At the initial stage, the media reported that no riots occurring, no robberies occurring in the affected area. Japanese people are so civilized. It must be true. It must be true. But this is another reality that there are certain people who may need living materials to sneak into the convenience stores and picking up some foods. And unfortunately, some other, this type of thieving is occurring in the luxury shopping. But it is also the other side. What I wanted to say here is that please don't make Japan a special case with wealthy country or very much civilized. But all the humans are universal and the same. So I hope you will have a vivid image of the more personalized understanding of the, how people are suffering there. And the nuclear accident complicated all the issues. This slide shows a kind of evacuation region with contamination. It's radioactive agents. It's not clear circular, but the evacuation order is made by the kind of circular style, and that created additional displaced people up to now 200,000 or 300,000. And now government is thinking about expanding the evacuation suggestion, which means a lot of more people will be displaced. And polluted water delays activities in the plant, and occupational limit of the exposure to radiation was lifted right after this event, maybe because it is needed to let workers to work there. The causality may be a bit different. And the mental health for the responders, workers, self-defense force, this is also another side to be considered. And the ethical challenge to order your subordinates to work in the very risky area with a lot of radiations are there. So these people, technicians sent to the power plant, had so many protection, but they don't have goggles to protect their eyes for the internal exposure. And the self-defense people with broken gloves, meaning they also need more protection to have to work appropriately. And all the nuclear power plant defect created a public allergy against the nuclear power plant. And not only the defected power plant, but also just recently, early this month, the Prime Minister ordered the other power plant, which is located very close to the area with so many earthquakes, shutting down or just tentatively suspend, which means electricity provision will be in a harder shortage. So Japan is now using about 30% of electricity from nuclear power and about 60% from the fossil fuels. So this is also have more long-term consideration. Also, the climate change issue, energy security are all included. And affected areas had certain capacities and factories that supported Japanese economy. And so this affected, these are additional economic considerations, and the people stopped purchasing and consuming a lot and turning off the electricity because of the electricity shortage, and the towns are like this, very much like a ghost town. And I would like to mention about the international climate. There are so many supports overseas. United States forces did so great job to support the people, and so many countries expressed its support. And there are another private donations, like Taiwan. From Taiwan, there are so many fundraising, and U.S., Korea did the same thing. It's so nice. But on the other hand, regional security is still ongoing. So even after the earthquake, there are certain emergent approach of the military forces overseas happened. So that decided the defense force to mobilize back to the original duty of defending the homeland country. These are the big picture, but I'd like to reimburse that all the issues still ongoing, and the long-term consideration will be needed, like displacement or reconstruction recovery will take 10 years or more, and the economy and energy security is still ongoing problem, and the radiological fear is another complication. And thank you very much for all the attention, and keep on paying attention. Thank you.
So what we'll do is go through the talks, and then time permitting, I think we'll all come up here and sit and have some dialogue with you. So with that, what I'd like to do is then move on to our next speaker. So our next speaker is Tom Kirsch, who's a valued colleague. So Tom has a primary appointment in emergency medicine and a joint appointment here in our school in international health, works with Gil Burnham and Court Robinson and others, and has this nice dual perspective of, if you will, conventional emergency medicine as well as disaster medicine, and travels all over the country and all over the world, helping in the response to and actually the preparation for all sorts of hazards. So Tom, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here and to talk about this important event. So just as a brief background, this is a print done by a Japanese artist in the late 1800s, named Hokusai. I can't remember his name. Hokusai, which points out the fact that tsunamis are not new to Japan. These have been going on for centuries in recorded history of Japan. There's been multiple episodes of deaths greater than 10,000 over the last number of centuries, and so it's a common event. So what I'm here to do is to kind of take a little bit of what Dr. Makino talked about and to set the stage for the true experts who are going to talk about details. And so I'm going to kind of give you a little background about the event and what the meaning of that is in regard to the health and the public health context from these events that occurred. So first we'll talk about the event. And I think you know about it a lot, so I'm not going to spend a lot of details on it. But this was not an event, it was 3 events. And so that's why this disaster is very different than most other disasters. If you remember correctly, I happened to be sitting up that night, working late like usual, and I was online with Google News, and it popped up that there was an earthquake in Japan. And I immediately started seeing videos of buildings shaking and people running around and stuff like that. But within 30 minutes, the earthquake meant nothing because the tsunami occurred. And it was truly the tsunami, because Japan is pretty well prepared for earthquakes, that was devastating and that changed the entire event into one that then included this nuclear crisis, which is very unique after an event, and yet is potentially predictable in many other settings, including within the USA. And so we got to consider that there's 3 events here, and it's very hard to discern how those different events occurred and what exactly happened to them, because they've all kind of rolled into one. So just as background, Tomo talked about this. This was a massive earthquake. Not only in its magnitude, it was a Richter 9.0, which is a giant earthquake. But because of what it did, the plates that are outside of Japan are subductive plates. So the Japanese islands are floating, and the plate next to us is rising above that. And what happened is the seafloor actually heaved up, literally heaved up 5 meters, in the range of 5 meters, and then settled about 3 meters up. And so what that did when the floor heaved up is it pushed the ocean up that far. It pushed hundreds of square miles of ocean up meters, meters and meters and meters. And that wave started moving towards the shore across a very long front, like Tomo mentioned, 170 kilometers, 300 kilometers, depending on who you read. And so you didn't get this massive, giant single tidal wave, kind of like you saw in Aceh after the earthquake in 2004. But you literally had an ocean that rose up and moved ashore, causing this massive tidal wave, massive tsunami. And so the tsunami was measured anywhere from 3 to 38 meters in height. Accurate measures are done at different places throughout the coast of Japan along the peninsula. 38 meters, 125 feet in height. So for the most part, it was a 10-ish meter tsunami, which is also huge. It's a 3-story building, basically. But it was a wave, or an ocean. You saw the videos. It just kind of moved ashore and washed away everything. And so it was a very unique event, a very different event, and had great ramifications. And my job is to kind of discuss the public health and health aspects of this. I'm not going to go into the details about the nuclear aspects of it because we have true experts here about that. And I'm also not going to go into details about the mental health aspects. But I want to just kind of set the stage about what the meaning was. So depending on who you read, my numbers are very similar to Tomo's, but not exact. There was a lot of damage. There's a lot of deaths. There's a lot more deaths to come. The moment that I saw those waves coming ashore, that ocean coming ashore, I knew that there were going to be tens of thousands of deaths. You cannot live through a tsunami, and that's what has the most important public health and health implications for us as responders, because the mortality is almost 100%. As you can see, most of the deaths, so it's hard, one of my questions research-wise was, how many people did the earthquake kill? And because in the Kobe earthquake in 2005, they killed 6,000 people. And right now, there's no data available, at least in English, that allows us to separate out earthquake deaths from the tsunami deaths. But so the closest I could get was, so far in the recorded deaths, autopsy deaths, 92% of them are from drowning. They're clearly from the tsunami. My suspicion is, given the preparedness of Japan and the distance of Tokyo and other major cities from the epicenter, that there's really going to be relatively few deaths directly attributed to the earthquake itself and not to the tsunami, in the hundreds, not in the thousands. But I wasn't able to separate that out. But that's important for response because it's a different response for the two different events from the health and the public health perspective. So for now, we know that about 90+% of the deaths are directly due to the tsunami and not to the earthquake itself. Lots of displaced people, estimates as high as 500,000. Of course, we never know. Even in the U.S., no one knows exactly how many people are displaced because so many people go to live with their relatives, frankly. Accurate counts in shelters did occur in later March, where there were 336,000 and 2,300 different shelters. So population movements were huge. The thing about this event that made it exceptionally complex was infrastructure damage. Because of the tsunami wiping out roads, buildings, etc., but also the earthquakes destroying power lines and roads and rail lines, etc., this infrastructure, our ability to respond as normal responders was greatly limited because of infrastructural issues, not because of technical expertise or even availability of supplies, but because of the infrastructure damage. There have been attributable deaths after the earthquake, which is also interesting from our point of view because we like to talk about preventable deaths. And in this one newspaper article I found, there were at least these 282 deaths that would have been termed preventable following the event. Seems like a drop in the bucket compared to 25 or 6,000, but it's 282 preventable deaths that something could have been done about had we responded differently. So let's talk about what disasters do to kind of, once again, set the stage for this discussion. Generally, we divide the disaster effects into direct effects and indirect effects. And speaking from a physician, it's the direct effects that I care about. And it's the injuries and the wounds and the infectious disease, et cetera, like that. Speaking from a public health person, and I've gone over to the dark side, I'm truly a public health person. It's really the indirect effects, because it's the destruction of infrastructure and resources that leads to long-term morbidity, mortality, population movements, refugee situations, internally displaced people, whatever you like to term it. But it's really these indirect effects, the destruction of infrastructure, which causes the massive public health issues, which are, for the most part, truly what leads to the most morbidity and mortality that's preventable, that we can do something about. So we'll talk about some of those. We know from multiple disasters over the centuries what disasters do, and it helps us to understand how to plan for disasters. And for the most part, if you look at this, like deaths, people are dead, we don't care, because there's nothing we can do about them. We as disaster responders care about injuries and population movements. Those are things that we can do about. And you can see that almost all disasters, except for earthquakes, don't injure a lot of people. And there's really a limited medical response you need. You don't really need a lot of medical response. Doctors are not that important necessarily for at least this acute phase where we're going to go in and fix the fractures and take care of all that. They are useful in the long phase where we just replace the healthcare system and give immunizations and treat coughs and colds. But in the acute phase, there's really limited stuff for doctors to do. But you can see, because there's a lot of population movements caused by these events, that there's a lot of public health issues that arise from these. So earthquakes are unique, and Haiti is a good example of that. It was estimated in Haiti that 235,000 people died from the event, and there were 300,000 injuries. That's a wild guess. No, there's no one to prove that. But 300,000 injuries is overwhelming for any healthcare situation, let alone in Haiti where there's no healthcare available. In Japan, because of the building structures, et cetera, the injury rate was much lower. But with tsunamis, because those tsunamis come ashore, they kill everybody. And so there's really limited emergent medical care that needs to be done for these events. And you have to keep that in mind because it changes our response. So we'll talk about these things briefly. First, earthquakes. So speaking from a public health person, how do you prevent earthquakes and how do you mitigate them? Interesting enough, so the best way is, of course, to not live where there's earthquakes. Tell that to everyone who lives in Japan and California. So that's obviously not going to happen. Number two with a bullet is building codes. It's really all about building codes. Haiti, 300,000 people died from a relatively small earthquake because there are no such thing as building codes. Chile, Japan, where they had earthquakes that were 1,000 times more powerful than the one that occurred in Haiti, you count the deaths in the hundreds. In Chile, there were less than 500 deaths with a Richter 9.0 earthquake. Half of those were attributed to a small tsunami, 250 deaths in a 9.0. And so it's all about building codes. And when you have good building codes and good structures, you don't kill as many people. That's the bottom line. This was interesting in Japan because Japan has created a series of sensors throughout its country to very quickly detect earthquakes. And they actually were able to give a 1-minute warning in Tokyo prior to the event actually occurring. And they have a whole system of communications and networks for informing people. And they attribute many lives saved to that, which is a very interesting. This may be the first phenomenon ever where an earthquake warning has saved lives. That hasn't been reported ever before. So it'll be interesting to see how that pans out. So it's all about construction quality, and we'll skip through that. So what do earthquakes do? Earthquakes, because you die, if you're in the middle of an earthquake and you're standing in a field, no big deal. You might fall down and sprain your ankle. It's buildings that kill people. And so the injuries are severe, and it's fractures and lacerations and all the things you would expect in a war setting, basically. And so there's a tremendous medical need from that. And you get all these fancy things, and I have some pretty ugly pictures that I can show you. These are broken bones that occur. These are all from Haiti, just so you know. These are the secondary wounds that occur after you do operations. They get infected, et cetera, and you get secondary wounds. This is a really cool photo of a CAT scan of how they totally rebuilt someone's face after having it crushed. So the injuries after earthquake are pretty devastating and very extensive. The indirect effects, the secondary effects, because they cause such disruption of the infrastructure, loss of buildings, loss of critical infrastructure like power, water, sanitation, all of those things that are essential to our civilization, essential to us to live, the indirect effects are very large and devastating also. The other indirect effect that Tomo alluded to was the economic impacts of earthquakes is tremendous. It affects the GDP, the entire economy of a country by terms of percentages, which is unlike any other disaster. that occurs where you have a very small blip after it. But earthquakes, because of the infrastructure damage, cause long-term, decades-long impacts on countries' economies. Tsunamis, and the only thing I want to summarize on tsunamis, and I think these pictures do it, is that you don't live through a tsunami, basically. So the prevention is don't live near the shore, obviously. Seawalls, Japan has spent billions of dollars building seawalls. All of them, because of the size of the tsunami, were basically overrun. And maybe seawalls are not good because they cause a false sense of security. They have evacuation shelters. It's estimated that in Japan, up to a third of the tsunami evacuation shelters were inundated by the tsunami itself. And so the question is, do those things help, or do they provide us a false level of comfort and maybe make things worse, at least for these massive events like this? This was a massive event. Early warning systems clearly are a critically important thing in tsunami. There are buoys scattered throughout the ocean. If you go to the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, they have lovely maps of where all the buoys are, and you can see them, and they're able to track progress in tsunamis. This occurred 30 miles offshore. There was no chance for their 70 miles. There was no chance for these people to evacuate. They were still busy after their houses had shaken and half fallen down, just trying to recover from that. And there was really almost no chance for them to evacuate from those areas because the tsunamis hit so fast. So the direct impact of tsunamis is you die. If you listen carefully to the search and rescue issues over the course of time frame, there was this famous rescue of the grandmother and her teenage grandson. Did you hear any other live rescues after this event? There really weren't many because you don't survive a tsunami. And so the medical impact is once again limited. There's very few things that I as a physician can do. There are lots of things that I as a public health provider can do. These are some of the types of things I wanted to briefly mention in the health response to disasters, and then we'll be done. First, we'll talk about public health. And I'm not going to go into details here. This event displaced 500,000 people. 500,000 people, essentially the same number of people that were displaced after Katrina. This creates tremendous public health issues that Japan struggled mightily with because of the transportation and infrastructure damage. For the first week or so, many of these spontaneous shelters that arose did not have access to sanitation and water and food and the things that are essential because of the lack of infrastructure and the lack of ability to deliver these things. We often talk about the need for communicable disease control after disasters. It is a big deal in less developed settings. It's not a big deal in the U.S. and more developed settings because the infrastructure is there, particularly immunizations are there, that prevent vaccine-preventable diseases, but there's better infrastructure to prevent diarrheal diseases, et cetera. There were reports in Japan of this, however. Disposition of the dead bodies is important, and after events that kill tens of thousands of people, we ignore all of these are the standard rules you're supposed to use. In Japan, rather than cremate people, there are mass graves, et cetera. And so that is a big health effect, a health important thing, but we often have to violate our own precepts there because of the need to do other things. I just want to touch on search and rescue. There were 40-some search and rescue teams that were deployed to Japan. Search and rescue teams from a global setting usually can't start functioning for 24 to 48 hours. The U.S. team deployed like usual, 2 teams. They made no live rescues. The ability for any global search and rescue teams in these situations to actually save lives is essentially zero, particularly after tsunami. Haiti was a little bit different in that there were 117 live rescues made in Haiti at the cost of about $2 million per rescue. But that was different because of the proximity to the U.S. and because it was an earthquake with structures that were kind of crummy structures, and so there were less deaths directly from those. And so the search and rescue issue in a humanitarian response, in my mind, is something that's not useful and that we should probably stop, but we do it anyway. So we're going to move through these. I want to move to this. In an event like this, in an event like Haiti, it's really the long-term medical care that becomes a big issue. Once again, once the acute phase is gone, in this case, which was very short because there weren't that many injuries, the ability to provide health care to these 500,000 displaced people and these, with the loss of the health centers, the doctors, the nurses, the pharmacy supplies, et cetera, is an issue that is going to be ongoing for months. Those with chronic diseases, those with hypertension, dialysis, et cetera, need care or they're going to die. And so provision of basic medical care is the most important thing after all of these disasters. Mental health, I'm certainly not going to talk about because I'm not an expert. So I just wanted to summarize very briefly. Even though I am a physician, even though I'm an emergency physician, I believe, like I said, I've gone over the dark side. It's the public health issues where we have to put all of our focus, where all of our efforts after disaster have to go into. If we're going to provide medical care, it has to be chronic care. It has to be provision of primary health care services like are done in all basic levels, all basic countries. And so just keep that in mind. And I guess that's the next. We'll do questions afterwards.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about the nuclear power plant situation. As Mike said at the beginning, that one of the things that's really so profound about the series of events that occurred here was you had two natural events that then precipitated a technological event. And the thing to me that's really made a big impression is that it's very difficult in doing disaster planning to think about a sequence of events. It's one thing to say, okay, how do we respond to an earthquake? How do we respond to a tsunami? It's even these days, of course, pretty obvious to say, how do we respond to an earthquake followed by a tsunami? But to think so far ahead to say, how do we think about an earthquake, a tsunami, and then a nuclear power plant event precipitated by the tsunami is obviously not something that's commonly done. And the thing to me that's so sobering is that if you ask the question, what started the radiologic event? It was the failure of generators. So it wasn't because the tsunami basically overran them. It wasn't the failure of some super duper high tech something or other. It was the failure of something that is so mundane, lots of us have them in our basement or backyard, right? It's just very simple old technology, and that's what then precipitated this very significant follow-on technological event. So let me just orient everyone a little bit quickly to radiation. So we talk about radiation in public health. I think the word radiation is a loaded word, and it's a word where we really need to understand. It's too broad a word to have any meaning in terms of human health risk. And so what we're really talking about in terms of human health risk here is ionizing radiation. So that's higher energy radiation that has enough energy to ionize atoms, which just means ejecting electrons from them. And what we're interested in terms of ionizing radiation is both particulate, that is particles, and electromagnetic. And when we think about human health risks, this distinction between particulate ionizing radiation and electromagnetic ionizing radiation is important. So let's follow on with that for a minute. So if I take an alpha particle and it's flying along in space and I hold up a piece of paper between me and the alpha particle doesn't come out the other side of the paper. It deposits all its energy in the piece of paper. A beta particle might come out the other side of the piece of paper, but it's only going to penetrate into the body 1 or 2 or 3 millimeters. So if the particles start out outside the body, they're really of very low risk to me. On the other hand, if those same particles start off inside the body, then there's no piece of paper or clothing or skin or anything like that for them to have to go through before they're in contact with potentially radiation-sensitive cells in the body. So with particulate ionizing radiation, I think to myself, I got to keep the radioactive atoms that are emitting those particles out of my body. If I can keep the radioactive atoms out of my body, then I keep those particles out of my body, in essence. I then turn my attention to X-rays and gamma rays, the electromagnetic radiation. It's a very different story. This is very, very penetrating ionizing radiation. It's going to go through the paper. It's going to go through me. I mean, a radiograph wouldn't work if X-rays didn't at least partially go through your body. They wouldn't come out the other side to expose the X-ray film. And in fact, even a thick piece of lead is only going to stop a fraction of X-rays or gamma rays. There's no way to stop them all. So from a public health perspective, how do I think about this? So if I have alpha particles and beta particles, if I have radioactive atoms that are emitting particulate ionizing radiation, my key job is to keep the radioactive atoms out of my body. If I have X-rays and gamma rays, so if the radioactive atoms are emitting electromagnetic ionizing radiation, then keeping the radioactive atoms outside my body is not going to do the full trick. And I need to think about reducing my exposure through distance, through shielding, and so on. So how does that then translate to the situation in Japan? So I basically said there's two possibilities for how you get irradiated. The radiation is either outside your body and is impinging upon your body, or the radiation is emitted inside your body. So for external radiation, where the radiation source is outside your body, the most risk is from X-rays or gamma rays that can penetrate into your body. And who's really of greatest risk there? It's the power plant workers. And Tomo showed you a picture of those power plant workers with a mask and with Tyvek suits and that sort of thing. That does not shield you against external irradiation from X-rays and gamma rays. And in fact, you may recall that at one point in the unfolding of the event, the radiation dose rate inside the power plant facility was so high that 800 nuclear power plant workers were evacuated and 50 were left to make sure that the pumps, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, that those pumps kept operating. I'm seeing nodding heads. Everyone remembers that. Well, what about the 50? They weren't walking around in giant lead suits, right? And so I actually think it's amazing that hardly anyone in the media talks about those 50 who basically received very high doses and in essence came as close to a suicide mission, to protect everyone else as possible. And so in a case like that, you really have to think about the workers. Now, I was also struck with Tomo's slide because really in the midst of an event like that with releases, a mask isn't enough, and you're really wearing self-contained breathing apparatus or some other active respiratory protection. But what the Tyvek suit and that mask are doing for you is preventing internal contamination, which is still really worth it, because the last thing you want to do is walk away from the source and carry radioactivity with you so you're still irradiating yourself. But for those power plant workers, the external irradiation was very, very significant. On the other hand, the internal irradiation scenario where the radiation source is inside the body, now I'm very much worried about those alpha and beta particles, even more than I'm worried about the X-rays and gamma rays. The greatest risk is to the general population who are breathing it in or ingesting it typically, right? And the power plant workers, ironically, even though they're right there on site, have a lower risk than the members of the general public that are in some vicinity to that power plant because of the personal protective equipment that the power plant workers are donning that the general public is not. So it's this kind of paradox that we have to think through. Well, what's going to happen either to the power plant workers or to members of the general public who receive radiation doses? So broadly speaking, there's acute effects and there's delayed effects. The acute effects include what's called a prodromal syndrome. That's sort of the stereotypical thing you hear about with radiation exposure in an acute sense: nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, fatigue, and so on. And then there's one of three different syndromes that occur acutely depending on your doses. And here I've expressed doses in rem, a very conventional unit of dose. And you notice that those syndromes are at either hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of rem. And just by way of comparison, every year all of us involuntarily pick up roughly, in Baltimore, 300 millirem of radiation dose. Cosmic rays, radioactivity in soil, building materials. Our own bodies are radioactive, so we're irradiating ourselves, and so on. So these are many-fold higher doses that are required for acute effects. The delayed effects, though, the big ones are cancer and then burns and cataract formation. So burns and cataract formation actually have a threshold that's a pretty high threshold. It's about the same as the prodromal syndrome threshold. And in fact, in this country, the way we train first responders in terms of responding to a radiologic event is it's time to get out of there if you're feeling nauseous. Okay? And so if we're below that level, then we're really below the level for these what are called deterministic effects, and our concern then turns to cancer. And in fact, with the members of the general public in Japan and elsewhere, it's really the cancer risk that's the concern. And what's key here is, from a public health practice perspective, we assume that there's no threshold, meaning any dose increases the risk of cancer, with larger doses proportionately increasing the risk more. And I've just given you one point or one risk coefficient there, where 1 rem yields a 0.05% lifetime attributable risk of a radiogenic cancer lethality. And so you can just put that into perspective. From a public health communications perspective, it goes back to this notion of the word radiation and kind of the inflammatory nature of the word itself. So if, in fact, cancer is the endpoint I'm worried about in terms of public exposures, and if, in fact, from a public health practice perspective, I cannot say there's such a thing as a safe dose, then my risk communication becomes very, very challenging, because the public doesn't want to hear your risk is low. They want to hear you're safe, which means zero risk. All right, so what actually happened at the power plants? And it's plants plural, of course, because there were several units involved. So what I show here on the left is a conventional fossil fuel power plant, and on the right, a nuclear power plant. And if you just take a quick look at those two drawings, what you should realize is, wow, a lot of the drawing is the same on both the left side and the right side. And basically what's happening here is I have a generator that's turning, and as it's cranking, it's producing electricity. And the way that generator turns is there's a steam turbine, bunch of fins, and as steam goes past those fins, it turns it like a propeller, and that cranks the generator, and I get my electricity. Well, where does the steam come from? The steam comes from boiling water. Okay? And so everything I've just said is identical in an old-fashioned fossil fuel power plant and in a nuclear power plant. The only thing that's different, believe it or not, is where the heat comes from to boil the water. Everything else at this level of drawing is 100% the same. And so in a conventional fossil fuel power plant, I'm burning fossil fuels. That's giving me the heat to boil the water. In a nuclear power plant, I have nuclear fuel in a reactor. And the nuclear fuel is undergoing a nuclear reaction called fission, where an atom splits apart into two fission products. And when that atom splits apart into two fission products, a lot of energy is released. Some other nasty stuff's released as well, but a lot of energy is released. Much of that energy is thermal or heat energy, and that's what's boiling the water. The important thing, though, is in a nuclear power plant, we like it that the fuel's giving off heat, but the fuel doesn't like it that it's giving off heat. And to me, it's no different than when we drive our cars, right? So from our perspective, in a car, how do we get heat in the winter? We get heat by diverting the radiator fluid into the passenger compartment. Why is that radiator fluid hot? because it's carrying off the heat from the engine. So from the engine's perspective, the radiator fluid is there to cool it. From our perspective, the radiator fluid is there to keep us warm in the winter. Same thing in a nuclear power plant. From our perspective, we want the water to get hot because that's what's going to boil and give us the steam for the turbine. From the nuclear fuel's perspective, the water's there to cool it. So from the nuclear fuel's perspective, that water is really, really important, because if that water goes away, then there's nothing to cool the fuel. In exactly the same way in your car, if you have a radiator leak and all your radiator fluid drains out, there's nothing to cool the engine. And then your car overheats very quickly. How do I keep the water going in the nuclear reactor? With a pump. Because I really have a circulating system here where I have water that gets boiled and turns to steam, goes and turns the steam turbine, condenses back into liquid form, and is pumped back into the reactor vessel that has the fuel. If those pumps stop working, that cycle stops in exactly the same way as if the radiator pump stops working or you have a leak in your radiator. It's 100% identical. And at a point like that, the fuel gets hotter and hotter and hotter because the fission reaction keeps going unless you shut down the reactor. Even if you shut down the reactor, you still have a problem because that fission reaction doesn't instantly go off, and you really have a hot situation for some time. So what happened in the power plant accident? Well, there were really two power plants, and the one we're focusing on is Fukushima 1, which is Fukushima Daiichi. Daiichi means number one, right, Tomo? Okay, so that's the one that we're focusing on. Both were operated by Tokyo Electric Power Company. There's Fukushima 1, 6 units. Units 5 and 6, not really part of the story. 1, 2, 3, and 4, the major part of the story. We had the big earthquake. 4, 5, and 6 had been shut down prior to the earthquake. So that was a controlled shutdown with a decay of heat. The remaining reactors shut down automatically with the earthquake. That's the good news. But you still had heat. That heat was taken away by the pumped circulating water with the emergency generators. That was good news for 30 minutes. Then you had the failure of the emergency generators. Over the following 3 weeks, there was a partial meltdown in units 1, 2, and 3, and that slide gives some of the evidence for it. In unit 4, you had spent fuel that also became a problem because it's still radioactive, it's still giving off heat as well, even though it's fuel that is not in the configuration of the reactor core. And so what you ended up with is a series of conditions in units 1, 2, 3, and 4 that had to do with a buildup of reactor pressure, some damage to the containment vessel itself, the containment building, and so that's when you're really going to get releases to the environment because you get a buildup of radioactive gases. If you have damage to the containment vessel and to the containment building, that's when you have your opportunity of release into the general environment. You heard about the evacuations, and in fact there was a lot of controversy about what's the proper radius for evacuation because the evacuations were of over a shorter distance than we would do in this country. Part of the challenge is we always draw these nice concentric circles, but as Toma was saying with respect to the tsunami, it actually applies to air modeling with a plume. You get if you model the release of radioactivity into air, it travels in a very directional pattern with respect to the wind. So which direction the wind's blowing is incredibly important. You've probably also heard that on the International Nuclear Event Scale, ultimately this was a level 7, a major accident That's because of what happened in aggregate across units 1, 2, and 3. Of interest, the first INES rating was a 5. Why did it go up to a 7? Because there was a lot more release? No, because there was a decision made to combine the releases from units 1, 2, and 3 rather than counting each of them separately. Makes sense, I think. Okay, what are the radionuclides that get released? Iodine, cesium, strontium, and plutonium. The big ones in Japan, iodine by far, and then some cesium. It's the iodine that got all the attention. And that's because we have some interventions for various internal contaminations, and potassium iodide is the one for iodine releases. It only protects the thyroid, and it only protects the thyroid while you're taking it. And so actually there was, I think, as usual, a lot of overselling of the iodine story. Let me end by talking a little bit about perception of risk, because I think this is a key component in all disasters, and particularly in a disaster like this that involves a radiologic component. So to me, the guru of risk perception is a psychologist named Paul Slovic, who decades ago basically said that the characteristics that drive human perception of risk fall into 2 groupings. One grouping that has to do with how dread the risk is. Is it uncontrollable? Is it fatal? Is the situation catastrophic, and so on? And a second grouping that has to do with how unknown the risk is. So do we know that we're being exposed to radiation right now? No, we can't sense it, and we are being exposed to radiation right now. The effects are delayed. Cancer has a latent period of decades, and so on. So if you think about it, ionizing radiation has all of the characteristics. I'm just a bundle of joy, aren't I? Well, ionizing radiation has all of the characteristics that drive perception of risk. And in fact, when Slovic did studies in folks about their perceptions of risks and then mapped different types of events to a coordinate system that had as the x-axis the dread factor and as the y-axis that unknown factor, there's nuclear reactor accidents. It's way out here to the upper right on this quadrant, meaning it has the most of those characteristics that drive perception of risk. So I think from a public health perspective, we have the physical risks to worry about, and we have the psychosocial risks to worry about. Okay, thank you. Next, I'd like to call on Luke McDonald. And Luke's area of expertise is water. And it's obvious that water is an important component of what we're talking about here. Obviously, water was part of the problem. But as Tom mentioned, water is also part of the necessary solution. So Luke is the program manager for the university's program in water and health. Luke, please.
Okay, so I wanted to talk to you today about protecting the water supply during times of crisis. And water is key to protecting lives and health following all disasters. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. The situation is going to vary depending on where you are. So after Haiti, we have a cholera epidemic, and we don't see that after Japan. So today's talk, what I'm going to focus on is the kinds of risks and the kinds of problems and the solutions to those problems that we would face in Japan or in the United States. So first of all, I just want to say that of the problems that are associated with water, number one, pipes are underground. So after an earthquake or a tsunami or a major event, this leads to leaks and problems and disruptions in the supply of water. You have power supply issues. All water supply depends on power. You need water to drive the plants, and you need water, I'm sorry, you need power to drive the plants, and you need power to pump the water throughout the system. There's passive flow of water in sewer systems. So sewers are gravity fed, and these are generally open systems. So during flooding situations, these become in contact with surface water. There's damage to plants. There's contamination release, so the groundwater can intrude into the water supply. There's saline intrusion after a tsunami, so the salt water can ruin your crop fields for decades to come. There's this decentralization of water systems. The ways in which these are organized can become problematic. So whether you have one large plant or whether you have many small plants becomes an issue. There are personnel issues after any disaster in any sector, and resource limitations, and I wanted to just stress that water is critically important for healthcare following this. So you need clean water to do surgery, you need clean water for the patients, etc. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about today is just give you a little snapshot of what happened after a major earthquake in 1995. There was a bit of a wake-up call. Discuss that in the context of what it takes to be prepared for a major event like this. Give you an introduction to the water supply and sanitation in pre-tsunami Japan, what happened after the disaster, that's post-tsunami, and some data gaps and opportunities for Johns Hopkins. Okay, so there was a major earthquake in 1995 centered around Kobe, which is a major city right there. And the reason that I bring this up is because, not because it was a big earthquake with respect to the numbers of people who died at that time. So there was 6,300 people, which is a lot, but still much smaller than today's event. What I wanted to focus on really was that there were 3,300 pipe breaks following that earthquake. And this was an unprecedented number of breaks within Japan, and there's a really high breaks per kilometer. And what this led to was the inability to fight fire. So you have these coupled problems. You have the problem of water supply, which leads to an inability to fight fire. You have a lot of loss of homes, $1 billion in property damage, and a long time to recover following that event. So what I want to focus on and take a look at is the timeline to recovery following this 1995 event. So electricity up after 6 days. Telephones, 14 days, not so bad. Gas, much longer, 84 days. Water, 3 months. It took 3 months to get full water coverage throughout the city and the surrounding areas. And this also applied to sewers, about 3 months. So this was a bit of a wake-up call to say that we weren't really prepared from a water supply perspective to address these disasters. And some of the particular lessons were that there was a failure of emergency shut-off valves. So when a pipe breaks, it starts leaking water everywhere. And what would happen if we all went home and turned on our taps? What would happen to the city of Baltimore? It would lose all of its water, right, if you live in the city. And there are valves which can shut down. They sense that pressure drop when there's a break in the pipe and will shut down the flow of water. Only 15% of the pipe breaks actually had those valves that worked properly. And the other 85% just spewed water everywhere, and we lost all the water in the reservoirs. So the pipe material was also, and this is no surprise, this has been known for a long time, shown to be a really important factor following this earthquake. So more malleable, ductile materials like steel and ductile iron are much better at following an earthquake as compared to cement or PVC, which is brittle and breaks. And so all of those little mini lessons developed into this idea that there needs to be a better nationwide plan. And so this was a catalyst for action. Okay, so all that culminates into a water safety plan. The water safety plan is the dominant management tool for the water supply across a country. So this is how countries are starting to look at their water supply from a daily basis as well as from a disaster preparedness basis. And the two components that deal with disasters are that you can install the proper hardware in order to face this disaster, and you can develop the proper software. That means a crew and a plan of action. So these are some photos of Japan following the tsunami. Okay. The water safety plan is a comprehensive risk assessment and risk management based perspective to protect water from the source to the consumer. And so on a daily basis, you look at areas which may be at a higher risk for Cryptosporidium, which is a pathogen, and you have a different plan to control the water supply in that region with respect to a region that doesn't have a problem with Cryptosporidium. Japan completed their water safety plan in 2008, and the basic components are to, and this is very simplified, the basic components are to identify the hazards, so that would be things like earthquake, where are the pipes more vulnerable, where the earthquake's likely to happen, and which pipes are going to break. Then you identify control measures. So that would be things like we're going to replace those pipes, or we're going to have bypass valves or something like that, so that if this pipe breaks, this other one's still working. And then you define monitoring measures to make sure that the system is working. You manage this plan, you implement it, and you iterate. So it kind of is this iterative process. That framework is set by the national government, but it's implemented at the local level. And there are many players in between, which is what we're going to see happen after the earthquake and tsunami. And so the spending priorities right now in Japan are things like flood control, it's about 40%, and sewer expansion. Japan historically has a low sewage network coverage, so there's a lot more home treatment systems. And about 35% of the national water budget is related to sewer expansion. From a disaster perspective, they're most focused on prediction, so that would be modeling where the disasters will occur and prioritizing the changes to water and sanitation infrastructure based on those results, and developing, again, the plan. That's the software. Okay, so here are just some examples of things that you can do to develop better hardware to deal with disasters. So for an earthquake, seismic capacity improvements. So that's the obvious stuff. Pipe material, joint material, structural improvements to the facilities. So that's the treatment plants themselves. You also want, and I think this is clever, a seismic resistant power supply. So you have this redundancy built into a cogen plant. You have your natural gas, so if that system is up and running, you can still provide water, but you also have tapped into the greater electric grid. And so many plants have developed their own cogen, many water plants have developed their own cogen electric plants on site. There are also damage control measures. So the emergency shutoff valves that we just spoke about. You can isolate the different tanks and reservoirs so that they aren't all connected and they don't all drain at the same time when the system starts to open up. And you want to have emergency backup connections, so that's redundancies in pipes. So if this neighborhood has one pipe that goes into it and that pipe breaks, none of those people get water. So they like to build in these sort of redundant systems. We also increase water storage. So that means bigger reservoirs, more tanks. And it's critical to put water in very important facilities like hospitals. And that's just a special case of increased water storage. The last thing I wanted to mention is temporary water supply units. So in Japan, they used a lot of water trucks. But in other places, you can use small-scale water treatment. OK, so this is the software. And don't look at that, because I spent about an hour trying to understand it. And I still don't, but the Japanese do, because you'll see they did a pretty good job after the tsunami. So the key thing I wanted to point out by showing this diagram is that there is a way in which the different players can interact and coordinate water response across sectors. So at the top, you have the Ministry of Health, Labor, and Welfare, and they're responsible for the water supply at large and across the nation. And then at the bottom, you have these local water utilities. And in between, you have the professional societies. So that's the Japan Water Works Association. And they coordinate things like discovering where the problems are, sending out survey teams, sharing information, sharing resources to get everybody up and running at the same time. Their role is to identify and fix problems and to provide a provisional supply while the main normal system is down. Okay. So before the tsunami in Japan, they have a lot of pipes. This is expected because it's a highly developed country. There's 610,000 total kilometers of pipes, 16,000 plants across the whole country. And unfortunately, seismic resilient materials are expensive. So only 6% of those pipes are of the ductile iron type, and 3% are steel, because steel is a lot more expensive than concrete. So 9% of the pipes throughout Japan are resistant to earthquakes, and the entire country is at a high risk for earthquakes. However, they can be very proud that in Japan there's a small leakage rate. So even though some of these systems are vulnerable, they are really watertight. And so the leakage rate in Japan is about 8%. And I actually thought I misread that when I first encountered it, because in the US, the rate is much closer to 30% for most cities. And in developing countries, it can be as high as 60%. So that's 60% of the water treated, send it out into the system, and it leaks into the ground, or somebody has their tap open, and it's totally lost. So that's a lot of wasted money and energy. The capacity of the reservoirs is going up across the country, and the majority of plants are small scale. But the majority of people receive their water from large plants. So I want to say a little something more about that. So shown here is a pie chart describing who gets their water where. So on the left, we see the number of water treatment plants by population size. And this light blue area, 15,527 plants, are treating populations between 100 people and 5,000 people. So that means that you have a lot of little plants scattered around everywhere, and that's to be expected. And you have a very small number of plants which treat large populations. So there's only 424 plants that that provide water to 50,000 people or more. And so this pie chart is a little bit skewed towards the small distribution side. So the U.S. would have bigger chunks in the middle and at the top end, but still most people are getting their water from those big plants. Because if you look on the right, you have about 10 million people who get their water from those 400 some odd large plants. And that's something that becomes important in disaster planning. So the pre-tsunami sanitation situation is that it falls under the purview of a different department. And so there's a real data gap, actually, about what's going on right now in the sewers because these two departments don't report their information in the same way. So 72% of Japan has sewer network coverage, as compared to about 84% in the U.S. And this is predominantly a new phenomenon. So in the last 10 years, Japan has risen from below 60% to over 70% sewer coverage. And that means that all of their pipes are much younger. So the average lifetime of the sewer system, the average age of the sewer system in Japan is 16 years as compared to 40 years in the U.S. That means that we're going to be spending a lot of money fixing all these pipes because they're going to be breaking and, we're going to have problems with our sewers. So there are 410,000 kilometers of sewers in Japan. Again, that's a big system. And most of these, even though they're new, are still low seismic capacity. And here's just sort of two extremes of what can happen following an earthquake. So this is a 2004 earthquake. And you see a manhole here has lifted. So these systems get jostled around during the earthquake. And this is very likely to be fractured underground. The other situation is that the water can flood over the sewer system, and there's a manhole that has surface water directly in contact with the water inside of the pipes. So that's a public health risk right there. In comes a tsunami. All right, again, this is the area we're interested in. Following the tsunami, the first part of the software plan is to get that hardware of the temporary water service up and running. And so the Japan Water Works Association was able to provide about 300 trucks within 4 days that have clean water in them, that's chlorinated water, and community residents could go to these trucks and fill up their water bottles. So the timeline actually is tremendously fast on response. You have 300 trucks that are ready within 4 days to provide that water, and within 20 days you have some 520 water tanks ready to go. Now it's interesting to note that not all of them are in service, and this reflects the dynamic nature of the problem. So as trucks would go online in areas would need the water right in the beginning, and then their normal supply would come into effect, they wouldn't need the trucks anymore. So you had this very dynamic situation. And by early April, there was a shift in focus from this temporary water supply to surveys and restoration, even though there are still some areas that are inaccessible for water relief. Another approach to providing temporary water service is at these evacuation centers and water distribution standpoints. And I just point this out. This is a map in the city of Sendai. And each of those dots represents a water distribution point or a water intake point. And so every day, some of these centers would be operating because they might have power, and some of them would not. So there were these, you would have to check the news just like you check the weather before you go out the door in the morning to see where am I going to get my water from today. And this took place over the period of about the first month or so, this temporary water service systems. And the third temporary water service that's critically important is water within these evacuation centers themselves. So I think Tom had alluded to this, that there was an outbreak of diarrheal disease in some of these facilities. And the reason was that there wasn't sufficient hand washing going on. There wasn't sufficient hand washing because the sewer systems were backed up and water was not being drained properly. So the Japanese Red Cross promoted hand washing as the intervention, and developed these, they use these small tanks right here to pilot this hand washing station for children so everyone could wash their hands and try to control the disease. And one thing that I was really interested in figuring out was actually how widespread was this problem and whether or not this was an effective control measure. So there's a real lack of information coming out of some of these sites. Okay. Temporary water service, I showed you some examples of how we can handle that. We want to restore the normal service. And that involves getting our pumping stations back online, fixing pipe breaks, and so on. So on the left, we have a pumping station that's inundated with water. And this guy right here is from the U.S. military. He has a small generator. He's trying to pump water out of the surface water. Picture on the right is a pipe burst. It's a surface pipe. There's water spewing up into the air. It's coming down and it's cold, so it's freezing. And so that presents all kinds of challenges in trying to get that leak fixed. Okay, so this is a real success. You remember 90 days following the earthquake in 1995, within a month, you went from a situation where 75% of households did not have water in the affected region to over 90% of households. So that's a really quick ramp-up phase. And that's in a large part due to this shift in water safety plans and to a focus on disaster response and trying to get these different teams coordinated in a more consistent fashion. And so although all of these homes have volumes of piped water, it's not clear how pure that water is right now for two reasons. So one is that during the pipe break event, there can be intrusion of water into the ground. And then the other is that there's this problem with radioactive contamination in water. And so as these households were getting brought online, there was the discovery that there was radioactive material in their food and water supply. And so we've already spoken a little bit about this, so I'm not going to go into any great detail. But this radioactive iodine and cesium, which was released, gets trapped into rain particles as they come down and are brought into the treatment distribution system. So this becomes a concern if the concentrations are above 300 baccalaureals per liter of iodine or 200 for cesium, that's for adults, and 100 baccalaureals per liter for infants. Tokyo responded to this by distributing a lot of bottled water. And this is not a sustainable solution, but this was an emergency plan to try to deal with something that was unforeseen at that time. The tap water restrictions, which took place during the first part of the tsunami, were lifted within a short amount of time, and the last one was lifted yesterday. So in the 80-some-odd communities where they found radioactive iodine in the water, most of those restrictions on drinking were lifted within the first few weeks, and today all of them are lifted. The other control measure to deal with this radioactive iodine problem was to either cover or shut down the water treatment plants during rainfall events. And it rains a lot in Japan at this time of year, so that becomes a real problem. The food restrictions have a similar origin. This atmospheric release of radiation gets into the water supply. It gets taken up into growing plants and incorporated into their tissue. So this is an ongoing problem. Just yesterday they found new sources of radiation in the bamboo shoots and mushrooms in one of the prefectures, and previously there have been contaminated apples. And this problem is something that the government is doing a good job of monitoring and reporting for. And so I think that from a public health management standpoint, at this stage, given that the radiation is released into the environment, monitoring the food directly is the best approach. Okay, so I'm going to conclude with a few data gaps and research opportunities, because that's what we do. So the Global Water Program at Johns Hopkins, and what most of us here are academics, I think that there's a lot of room to discover new solutions to these problems related on these key data gaps. So one is the water-related disease. There was not extensive reporting yet of chronic illnesses, or diarrheal illnesses and things like that relating from the water supply. Contaminants in home taps. So all of the data which I was able to find were water quality data coming out of treatment plants, and they were not coming out of people's homes. And between the plants and the home, there's the risk of additional contamination. There can be a lot of research done, and there's a whole field of research on these risk assessments and vulnerability assessments related to pipe breaks, related to evacuation, and so on. And there's a lot of room for improvements in understanding how the sanitation system fares, because that's one thing that lags. So all the attention was on the nuclear situation, less attention was on the water supply, and even less attention was on the sewer system following this event. And finally, I think that the temporary water supply is a key area in which Johns Hopkins can provide some new solutions. So imagine if we could provide a water system that you could put on the ground within 6 hours, that provided water without any external inputs, and served communities ranging in size from 50 units, 50 people to a few thousand people. You could use that in Japan because there was a real need for getting these mobile units around when the trucks could not, and you could use that in Haiti because even today there's still a lack of decent water infrastructure. And just wanted to put another plug in there that hospitals in particular need clean water, and that's an area where Johns Hopkins, I think, can make a difference. So, thank you.
Okay, so our final speaker of the afternoon is George Everly. So George is a longtime colleague of mine, an expert in disaster mental health with faculty appointments here at Hopkins and at Loyola University, Maryland. And we've already foreshadowed his talk, I think, but several of us have mentioned the important mental health and psychosocial effects of events like these, any disaster, but particularly one with radiologic in its nature. George?
Thank you for the honor to be here. I don't know about you, I'm depressed already. But that's actually my job, isn't it? It's not to make you depressed, it's supposed to help you with it. I'm a psychologist by training. The field of disaster mental health was probably officially born 1991-92. Good news is it's a nascent field, exciting, a lot of opportunities. Bad news is it's a nascent field. We screw up a lot, and we've certainly done that. What I'd like to talk about today a little bit is strategic planning. I want to make it very clear. Japan will recover with or without disaster mental health initiatives. Societies have been recovering for millennia. And what we try to do is three things. I want you to think about 3 words, okay? You can write these on the back of your hands. This is what my field is all about. It's pretty pathetic when I stop and think about it, but this is what I do. It's stabilization. We try to stabilize. We mitigate. So stabilization, what do we do to keep it from getting worse? Mitigate, can we do something to make it a little bit better? And facilitate, so stabilize, mitigate, facilitate. Facilitate access to the next level of care when such things are truly available. Oh, okay. I don't know why it's doing this. It's just kind of neat, I guess. I hope it's not going to keep doing this. What is the state of the art in disaster mental health? Very similar to physical health. I want you to think of a continuum of care. It's not a one-off-the-shelf implementation. It's not just establishing of a crisis telephone hotline. It's not just, and I cringe when I hear this, but every time you hear something happening certainly in North America, I want you to read somewhere in the article, because you will hear the line, and grief counselors were dispatched. And I get this image of Winnebagos with little yellow smiley face flags heralding off to the site. That's not exactly what we do, but telephone hotlines certainly is something that we do as part of the continuum of care. We certainly do talk about mobile crisis outreach. We talk about holding town meetings. We talk about surveillance, assessment in the field, facilitating access to the next level of care, whatever that may be. So a continuum of care is a very important concept for us. I want you to think in terms of stages of disasters. Part of the art form when we deal with any continuum of care is choosing the target population, choosing the right tools for that target population. For example, I think of segmenting a target. We have school children. We have people working at the nuclear plants. We have civilians. We have farmers. We have people that work in the cities and in the farms. They may be arguably distinct and separate target populations, that different tools will be used for different populations. And this concept of phases of disaster suggests that timing actually makes a difference. So what I'm going to do is simply take you on a very quick sojourn through the notion of what to do and when from a strategic planning standpoint. Oh, I'm sorry. So pre-disaster. Now, hindsight's 20/20. But if we know that we live in a high-risk venue, a high-risk area, or if we know that we are working with individuals who we put at high risk. So we talk about sending EMTs and firefighters and police officers and the urban search and rescue teams, for example, who certainly did respond to Japan. We talk about the military. We know that we put these people in harm's way. So either by their occupation, their response functions, or perhaps where people reside or work, they may be at high risk. In the pre-disaster phase, what can we do to instill some sort of immunity psychologically or behaviorally? Well, the tools that we've identified so far is training, specific training in what the threat may be and how to respond to it, and preparing. If you remember Rudy Giuliani, politics aside, one thing he said is relentless preparation was the key to ultimately surviving 9/11 and coming back online as quickly as they did. The impact phase. What do you do there? What is the mental health function there? Information. People crave information. People typically, in my experience, and I have responded in disasters in 22 countries over 30 years. The irony for me as I was thinking about this talk, I responded to floods, I responded to earthquakes, and I responded to radiologic disasters. I've never responded to all of them in one, though. So this is truly a unique challenge. So my experience tells me, and I think the literature supports this notion, that as the impact unfolds, and it is still unfolding, and I think the previous speakers made an excellent point of this. Yes, the earthquake is done. Yes, the flooding is done. However, the radiologic aspect of this lingers on, and the implications may not be known, not for months, not for years. I am reminded of an endocrinologist, perhaps the greatest endocrinologist of the last century, a guy by the name of Hans Selye. He is most noted for his taking of the term stress from physics and bringing it into biology. He was also an exquisite experimental surgeon. But I do remember the thing that he chose to be most remembered for, and it was actually on the invitation to his retirement party, of all things. And he said, "It's not what happens to you that matters, it's how you take it." Well, that's my world. That's the world. And it begins with information. People, in my experience, do not want to be taken care of per se. They want to be assisted. And as culture probably does make a difference in my 22 countries on 6 continents, I will see cultural differences. But I would argue that Japan is such a culture, as many are, that desire more information than direct help. A very self-sufficient culture from my perspective. So we must provide information. I find many leaders, however, that hesitate to provide information. A tremendous leadership flaw. For they will say, we do not want to say anything prematurely. We do not want to say anything that is wrong. And believe it or not, it is better to be out there, communicate that you are doing something, that you are assessing the situation. There is no such thing as an information vacuum. I will promise you that. When something ugly happens, if you as a leader, if you are not speaking, someone else is, and it's usually the most distressed people around. So fill the information void. If you must change your information, do so. People are remarkably flexible, far more flexible than perhaps we give them credit for. Reassurance as appropriate. So information and reassurance as appropriate. Don't make promises you can't keep, and promises don't have expiration dates. I'm full of these little pithy things. This is a picture. This is the impact. And some of you, we obviously have accessed the same photo album here. I look at this and it just, again, boggles the mind. And this is the aftermath. In some ways, this could be a visual metaphor for what you expect in the wake of the previous slide. And again, this is impact. I teach a class in disaster mental health here, and when I first started teaching it, I gave an exam, and on the exam I said, what is the disaster mental health plan for the impact in a disaster? And beyond information and reassurance, there simply is none. The highest priority of all, of course, is survival. Sendai Airport. This is kind of amazing. This is where my work has been done to this point. I received a phone call about 48 hours after the flooding of Sendai, and there is a school here for air traffic controllers, and there is also a school for pilots. Those are two subgroups right away. There are some of the air traffic controllers that saw some of their colleagues actually swept away. So the call to me was, how do we formulate a disaster mental health plan? What do we do? And again, it begins with meeting basic physical needs, which I think has been covered very well by previous speakers. You must always start there. Meet basic physical needs. But Abraham Maslow told us that, didn't he? He created that wonderful hierarchy, and at the very bottom was meet basic physical needs, for it ultimately has a trickle-up effect to help people psychologically. So our first notion was provide physical support when possible, provide information as things unfold. And as was pointed out by previous speakers again, there were also fires, and the ability to suppress fires was inhibited by the lack of water. Now there is, according to the construct that I've just shown you, from the impact, we then begin to see the behavioral and psychological phase emerge in the context of heroic actions. People are doing heroic things. We expect that. History has taught us that. The best mental health intervention, first and foremost, is to get out of people's way. Let them do what they do well. But what is very important here, beyond meeting basic physical needs, providing information, providing reassurance, is visible leadership, and from the mental health point of view, surveillance and assessment in the field. And this is where we believe, from the public health point of view, that anyone on the front line can be taught simple surveillance skills and assessment skills. In fact, out of the center that I work for, John Links in, we have been teaching psychological first aid skills for, 5+ years now. And our notion was, no, during a disaster, this is not a time to put mental health clinicians in boats and send them out there. This is not a time to import mental health clinicians who may have no familiarity with the culture. Rather, this is a time where we should have pre-trained people that are on the front line, whose greatest value may be being able to recognize people who are having difficulty adjusting psychologically, behaviorally, and then moving along, if you remember the first concept, the concept of continuum of care. Search and rescue. Again, these same people that are doing the physical search and rescue, in my humble opinion, should be taught psychological first aid skills, no different than we teach them physical first aid skills. You'd be surprised how many people are physically incapacitated because of psychological factors, where simple reassurance, information, and support can take this person from being a casualty and a burden on the system to being now back to functionality. And that is what ultimately defines a casualty, is can you function or can you not? Some of my colleagues, unfortunately, have the notion that we descend on these populations, surveys in hand, doing assessment. Nothing could be or should be further from the truth. Rather, what we do is we key into a very simple concept that's been used in psychiatry for years and years, and that's activities of daily living. Can people function? If they can't, regardless of what those demands are, they are considered a casualty, and we do direct intervention. If they can, either with some modicum of assistance or independently, we don't consider them a casualty. We provide information and support so that they can continue. All of this to bolster the notion of support from a psychological standpoint. Sir Francis Bacon many years ago said, information itself is power, and I believe that. And let's not forget this person here who is performing a heroic function in and of itself. Let us not forget the first responders, the search and rescue people, another segment that we should target and say we should provide. If we are putting them in harm's way psychologically, then we have an obligation, it seems to me, to provide some sort of support for them as well. Again, we've heard of how this has complicated matters, but I'm also reminded that like terrorism, the unresolved, the unseen, the ill-defined takes a greater toll on the psyche than what you can see and what you can measure. So my concern is the radiologic effects will have more of a psychological detriment to the population than perhaps a physical one. We entered the disillusionment phase. People take stock of what's left. This is what we lost. This is what we have. Most people are thankful for what they have, but invariably they bottom out. So this is the disillusionment stage. We provide information, social reunification. We play the role of advocate and liaison, and psychological crisis intervention. These are the tenets that have been taught since World War I. We know they work. Study after study after study tell us that the simple principles of proximity, immediacy, and expectancy can help people return to functionality. In World War I, in the absence of these principles, 5 to 10% of people were returned to combat. With these principles, 70% of people were returned to functionality in combat. Psychiatric intervention is sometimes needed. We sometimes forget that some people have already been prescribed psychiatric medications, but they're gone. So one of the best things that we can do is simply do the assessment and renew those prescriptions. The psychological first aid that I mentioned earlier is recommended by the World Health Organization, the Institute of Medicine, NIMH. What we did here at Hopkins was very novel, however. Our psych first aid program was geared to non-mental health clinicians, where every other extant program was geared for mental health clinicians. Our notion was people in the front line, they're your first line of resistance. Recent evidence suggests that anywhere from 9 to 25% of a directly affected population will need direct psychological support. But that direct psychological support may be provided not by clinicians as much as people trained in psychological first aid. Part of our job is to anticipate surge, but also to respond with enhancing surge capacity. The model that we use here at Hopkins, I think, is the best in the world at doing that. Evidence also suggests that psychological crisis intervention is actually superior to traditional counseling and psychotherapy, and that may come as a surprise to you. Probably the best single study that came out of the World Trade Center was conducted by the New York Academy of Medicine, and they found that simple crisis intervention services enhanced recovery, facilitated recovery, seemed to lead to or be associated with less post-traumatic depression and post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, you're sitting down because this one takes your breath away. They also found that counseling done in the acute phase, psychotherapy done in the acute phase, was not only inferior to crisis intervention, but appeared to exert an adverse iatrogenic effect. It appeared to be toxic. In fact, in a dose-response relationship, the more psychotherapy people got, the worse they got. And reconstruction, leadership, again, is an imperative. Establishment and support of social networks. Continued crisis intervention, as indicated. We know I was privileged to serve Rudy Giuliani in New York. One of the first questions he asked me 4 days after the buildings came down is, what's my, I've got a catchment area, he said, of 10.5 million people. How many people are going to need help? We were able to make some estimates on that. But one thing that I also explained to him was that the trajectory for the civilian population will be very different than the trajectory for the first responder population. I said I have very low concerns for the responders until you close the site. And that's when you will start to see your psychiatric manifestations there. And counseling then becomes very appropriate. Lastly, I took this picture. One of the things that we seem to believe is that faith in something greater than yourself seems to help enhance resiliency in populations. And I've seen that culture to culture, country to country. If all you believe in, I'm not preaching to you, but if all you believe in is what you can see, and what you can see is gone, then there seems to be a lower level of motivation to recover. I was honored to help the country of Kuwait recover after the first Gulf War. In fact, I helped build their mental health system. And my final address to the Kuwaiti parliament, I said something very simple, and I said, you have all the money that's required, you have reconstructed the infrastructure, but until the population feels the desire to recover, to rebound, to be resilient, the country will never recover. In effect, I agree with Selye. It's not what happens to you that matters. It's how you take it. Thank you so much for your time.
What I'd like to do is call all the speakers up to the stage, and we'll entertain questions and comments from the audience. Does anyone have a question or comment? Please.
Well, I think one of the things Hopkins can do, one of the things that we do best is research, and providing new solutions. I mean, I'm a water guy, so I'm going to focus on that. To water problems, and providing the evidence base for success would be one of our key contributions in the future. Knowing what response mechanisms work and what doesn't work. And I can't actually personally speak to working with the Japanese government or NGOs, but.
Yeah, along the same lines, Japan historically has tremendous disaster expertise internally. And because of the language issue, most of that is unavailable to non-Japanese speaking people, because most of the literature is published in Japanese. And that alone is a huge barrier for me, because I do a lot of work on hospital and healthcare system preparedness. And none of that literature is available for me. So collaborating and publishing outside of the Japanese language world would be a huge help for the whole world, not just for Japan, because we don't have access to that information, and Japan has tremendous experience in those areas. So I think trying to encourage collaboration and publication beyond Japanese literature would be important.
And just to expand a couple of things. First of all, in putting this session together, the challenge wasn't, how can I find 5 people to talk? The challenge is, I have 50 people who would be relevant in terms of giving talks. One of the things I'm always amazed about in public health is the tendency to silo, when in fact there's profound cross-disciplinary benefits. And so I think, international health. I could take that Department of International Health and put it in Appalachia, right? And because it's not really international, it's low resource. And similarly, if you think about disasters, so a post-disaster location is a low resource location that didn't experience a disaster. And so a lot of the thinking is actually quite the same. The challenges are the same, whether you have an infrastructure that's wiped out or an infrastructure that was never there in the first place from a public health perspective. So I actually think there's a lot of synergism across a lot of disciplines, and part of the challenge is getting everyone to recognize what their contributions are in terms of an event like this, because it's not just the disaster health folks who have a lot to contribute. With respect to thinking about who's the target for our contributions, I'd like to suggest that it goes way beyond the Japanese people. And so, you know, I had my 15 minutes of fame getting interviewed left and right in terms of the nuclear event. And none of the questions had to do with the Japanese people. They had to do with the American people. And so, the concerns that folks were experiencing in this country were intrinsically valid. So even if there was not a scientific foundation for the concern, the fact that the people were having the concern meant the concern was intrinsically valid from a psychosocial perspective. And I liked George's emphasis on information. So the one thing that we can do is serve as reliable, independent, unbiased sources of information. And that's not just sources of information or technical expertise to Japanese government officials. It's sources of information to our own constituencies as well.
Let me follow up, because you made the comment that working in the Japanese culture may be difficult. I think it's difficult for people outside of the culture. And I think we should learn from that. I first started working in Japan in the mid-1990s, and I was asked to go by actually the Japanese Occupational Medical Association in the wake of what was not a very well-published epidemic in suicide. And the notion was that I would come from the Western perspective and bring some insight into how to deal with suicide into the Japanese culture. And the more time I spent there, the more I realized that it's not about taking Western resources and putting them in a Japanese culture. It is taking what we have learned about mental health universally and applying them within the Japanese culture, in effect bolstering the natural resiliency that already resides in the culture, rather than trying to bring some foreign concept in. I think to try to do that is a mistake. But identifying natural sources of resiliency, providing information, as I suggested earlier, and identifying how we can bolster the unique strengths in a culture is what we bring to the table.
Other questions or comments? Go ahead, please.
Thank you for excellent presentations. My name is Toru Matsubayashi. I'm from Department of International Health. Actually, I just came back from a medical mission in Minami Sanriku, which was in the most northern part of Miyagi Prefecture, hardest hit by the tsunami. So I have actually two comments. Well, actually one comment, sorry. So as Dr. Kirsch said, it was so true. This disaster medicine was disaster public health. So many public health issues are ongoing, including virtually every single discipline of what this School of Public Health has. But one thing I most acutely noticed was this complete destruction of the health systems. Not so many people mentioned this, but this area was so medically underserved and probably economically most underdeveloped by Japanese standards even before this disaster. So now that so many medical professionals, including nurses and doctors, are swept away, a complete vacuum is created in terms of these health systems, human resources, medical information systems. So far, a lot of different medical volunteers are providing healthcare there. But what I noticed was, when I was looking at the medical record, at one time the patient was seen by MSF, the next time the patient was seen by this Israeli medical team, then the next time the patient was seen by me. So the meaningful continuity of care doesn't exist. So I just think providing enough human resources in this particular area in the future would be a huge challenge. Then the other thing I noticed was this destruction of medical records, medical information systems. This area is so aged, even by Japanese standards. The population is so old. There are so many 80, 90-year-old people. So naturally, they take so many medications, they have so many past medical history, but they lost everything. They lost all of their medications, medication list, their medical records, as well as their primary care providers were swept away. So I saw so many patients who just didn't know, who had no idea what medicines they were taking or what problems they had. So reestablishing their medical care from scratch would be a huge endeavor. So yeah, I was kind of depressed just by being there. So those two things are what I noticed most acutely. But lastly, the other thing I want to point out is this: even though this disaster is huge, it happened in 3 prefectures out of 47. So the majority of Japan is actually back to normal. The life in Tokyo is pretty much back to normal. So I feel, please don't be scared to go to Japan. If you are thinking, or if you are thinking of visiting Japan, please do so. They would welcome you. They need such a tourism industry back. They need, such normalcy. So that's the message I'd like to convey here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I just make a quick comment?
Please.
So the medical record thing has become a big issue in the U.S., particularly since Katrina, because we had a similar problem with all the evacuees. And there's been work in the private sector now, particularly in the pharmacy industry, to preserve and to create electronic medical databases of at least medication lists for patients all over the country. Providers like Walgreens, the drugstore, now has these electronic databases. The Pharmaceutical Manufacturing Association is doing work to create these things. The American Medical Association is working. I've been on a panel to create an electronic medical record, which would be either a cloud-based medical record or a little chip that you can carry with all of your medical records. So there's a lot of work going on this area because it's a big deal. There are still no elegant solutions yet, but
I wish their cell phone actually
yeah.
could have some medical record, because even though they run away from tsunami without carrying anything, most people
Have their cell. Correct.
Please.
Dr. Links, I wanted to follow on your comment about the intrinsic validity of concerns we had domestically and how we can learn from the Fukushima event and inform our own policy recommendations here. I know there isn't, for example, a federal policy regarding potassium iodine distribution within the United States, and there has been a lot of chest thumping on the Hill about this needs to be taken care of and done. There are other issues regarding evacuation plans. In Japan, it was very conservative, or in the United States, it was very conservative compared to Japan, seemingly more liberal evacuation plans. So I just wanted to know if, the panel in general, if there are major lessons you feel can be learned from the Fukushima event here domestically.
So I'm a physicist, as Mike Clegg said. Why the heck am I running a center on disaster mental health? Because if you look at the history of disasters in terms of the definition of casualty, in terms of dysfunction that George gave, in most disasters, a psychosocial casualty compared to a physical casualty, it's 10 to 1 to 100 to 1. So in terms of demands on hospitals, the healthcare system, and the public health system, it's psychological casualties that far outnumber physical casualties, even though obviously physical casualties are very important as well. In that context, I absolutely hate the phrase, the worried well, which probably all of you have heard about. Oh, the worried well are clogging up our system. There's nothing wrong with them, and they're showing up at emergency departments and other points of healthcare distribution. Well, if they're showing up, they're not well. And so it's very misleading to think in those terms. So thinking about what we can do in disaster health to address the full spectrum of casualties is absolutely critical. Part of that then has to do with how we talk about different interventions. So, for example, evacuation versus sheltering in place. That's one of my favorites. So if you look at most releases of hazardous materials that are one-time releases, you are breathtakingly better off to shelter in place than to try to evacuate. I'm not talking about psychologically, I'm talking about, in fact, in terms of physical risk. Conveying that message, really, really hard. Some of you may remember the Department of Homeland Security's duct tape and plastic message. It was completely valid from a scientific perspective, and the rollout of it was terrible. It became the punchline to a bunch of jokes, right? Another example is potassium iodide. So there's so much misunderstanding about potassium iodide. And of course, you know, most of the interviews I did focused on potassium iodide. And so the effects in this country psychologically really were what public health needed to address. Even here in Maryland, there was detectable radioactivity in air and in rainwater. But you say that and you think, okay, what was the level of activity? Breathtakingly low. Our analytic techniques just happened to be so sensitive that we could pick up very small amounts. And so the challenge isn't the radioactivity in the air and the rainwater. The challenge is the fact that there's radioactivity in the air and the rainwater. And so what I've always thought is that public health in general does a very poor job in terms of risk and health communication, with exceptions. I mean, our Center for Communication Programs does an awesome job, but public health in general doesn't do a very good job. Emergency management doesn't do a good job, the DHS duct tape and plastic being an example of that. And so I actually think boy, if I could have my pick of interventions that we'd get a lot better at and do a lot more of pre-event, it wouldn't have anything to do with making the buildings more resistant or stockpiling a bunch of drugs. Those are important, but it would all be around risk and health communication. Thank you very much for your attention and your participation.